The small town of Hollow Pines held many secrets, but the old hospital on the outskirts was the darkest of them all. Hollow Pines General had been abandoned for over 30 years, yet its reputation only grew darker with time. Locals avoided it, and even the bravest souls barely dared to look at the hulking building as they passed by. Rumors whispered of a hidden basement deep within the structure, a basement that held echoes of twisted experiments and the lost souls of those who had never left. That fall, the legend began spreading among the high school students again. Stories of disembodied cries, flickering lights in boarded-up windows, and strange shadows started circulating like ghostly echoes. And as it often happens, the allure of the forbidden drew two unlikely adventurers into its grip. Max and Daniel were best friends since childhood, bonded over a mutual love for thrills and the uncanny. They were both 16, lanky, and fueled by that unique blend of curiosity and bravado only teenagers possess. For years, they had heard rumors about the hospital, but it wasn't until that chilly October evening, as they sat in Daniel's garage discussing urban legends, that the dare was born. "Have you seen the videos?" Max asked, leaning in close, eyes alight with mischief. Daniel shrugged, though his gaze flickered with interest. "Yeah, but everyone knows those are fake. Besides, who cares about some old building?" Max smirked, knowing just how to push Daniel's buttons. "Oh, come on. Everyone's saying you can hear stuff in the basement. Stuff that's alive." He let the word linger, watching Daniel's face closely. Daniel scoffed, but there was a tremor in his voice. "Alive? Like what? Ghosts? Demons? Or maybe it's just haunted patients," Max replied, lowering his voice dramatically. "Remember Mr. Hargrove? The old guy at the gas station? He told me there were experiments down there. The hospital was closed down because things went wrong. Really wrong." "That's just a story," Daniel insisted, trying to sound brave, but the curiosity had already wormed its way in. "What's the matter?" Max taunted, grinning. "Scared? Scared? Please." Daniel's pride wouldn't let him back down. "I'll go, but only if you come with me." "Midnight?" Max asked, his grin widening. Daniel hesitated, but he felt a thrill at the thought. He nodded, sealing the dare with a handshake that felt colder than the air around them. And so, that night, with flashlights in hand and a mix of excitement and fear boiling in their stomachs, the boys set out for the abandoned Hollow Pines General Hospital, unaware that it would be the last time they'd ever be seen. The hospital loomed like a dark sentinel against the midnight sky, a skeletal reminder of a forgotten era. Its towering walls, once pristine, were now overrun with ivy and rot, giving it an almost organic, pulsing quality under the faint glow of the moonlight. "Let's go through the side window," Max whispered, pointing to a broken window hidden beneath a thick tangle of vines. They climbed through, their flashlights cutting thin beams through the dust and darkness. Inside, the silence was suffocating, broken only by the scurrying of unseen vermin and the creak of ancient walls settling in the cold. They walked slowly, taking in the dilapidated hallways lined with rusted beds and scattered medical equipment. Torn curtains fluttered slightly, despite there being no breeze. "Spooky," Daniel muttered, his voice echoing in the vast emptiness. Their footsteps reverberated down the hall as they moved deeper into the building. Old posters and faded notices adorned the walls, remnants of a time when this place was filled with doctors, nurses, and patients. Now, it felt as though the building itself had absorbed years of pain and suffering, its walls heavy with unspoken horrors. "See anything yet?" Max asked, sounding almost disappointed. Daniel shook his head, glancing around. "It's just old." They ventured deeper, passing through waiting rooms with broken chairs and reception desks strewn with ancient papers. The air was thick with the musty scent of mold, decay, and something else. Something metallic and sharp that lingered at the edge of perception. Their destination was the basement, the heart of every haunted hospital story they had heard. The basement, the place where it was said doctors performed unspeakable experiments, where patients were subjected to horrors that had finally forced the hospital to shut its doors. After navigating through a maze of hallways, They finally found the narrow stairwell that led down into the hospital's underbelly. The steps were chipped and uneven, and each one groaned under their weight as they descended. "Still think this is just a story?" Max asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let's just keep going," Daniel replied, feeling a growing sense of dread. As they descended, the darkness seemed to thicken, swallowing the light of their flashlights. The basement was colder, and the air grew heavy, as though they were sinking deeper into the earth itself. The hallway stretched before them, narrow and lined with doors on either side. Some were closed, while others hung open, leading into rooms filled with old hospital beds, broken equipment, and overturned chairs. But each room carried a disturbing similarity. Rusty chains and restraints bolted to the walls, stained with something dark and ominous. Daniel shuddered, feeling his pulse quicken. "Max, let's be careful, all right?" Max forced a grin. "What's wrong? We haven't even found anything interesting yet." As they continued, they noticed faded signs pointing towards Ward C and experimental treatment. The flickering lights on their flashlights illuminated the peeling paint and cracks running like veins along the walls. Then, a faint sound broke the silence, a shuffling, dragging noise that echoed from somewhere down the hallway. Max froze, gripping Daniel's arm. "Did you hear that?" Daniel nodded, swallowing hard. They both stood still, holding their breath as the sound grew louder, coming closer. But just as quickly as it had started, it stopped, leaving only the ominous silence. "Probably just a rat," Max muttered, though his voice wavered. They pressed forward, their eyes scanning every shadow as they passed room after room. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to weigh heavier with each step, as if something were watching them, lurking just beyond the reach of their flashlights. Eventually, they found themselves standing in front of a thick metal door, different from the others. Rusted chains hung from the frame, and a sign above it read, "Restricted access. Authorized personnel only." Daniel hesitated, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Maybe we shouldn't. But Max had already grasped the door handle, giving it a pull. To their surprise, it opened with a low groan, revealing another set of stairs leading even further down into the darkness. "Are you coming or not?" Max asked, his voice daring yet uncertain. Daniel took a deep breath, nodding. "Yeah, let's go." The stairs led them to a wide corridor with polished tiles that reflected their flashlight beams. Unlike the other parts of the hospital, this hallway looked eerily pristine, as though it had been frozen in time. At the far end of the hall stood a single door with a glass panel, through which a faint light flickered. Approaching cautiously, they peered through the glass and saw a room lined with strange machinery. A large metal chair, bolted to the floor, stood at the center, surrounded by devices with wires and tubes dangling ominously. "What is this place?" Daniel asked, his voice barely audible. Max stepped inside, his flashlight illuminating the machinery. The room was filled with a nauseating stench, something sour and metallic that clung to the air like a ghostly residue. As they examined the equipment, something caught their attention. A series of faded photographs pinned to the wall. They showed patients strapped to the chair, their faces contorted in agony, eyes wide with fear. Some of the images were blurred, but each one told the same story, a story of suffering, of unimaginable pain. Max's stomach turned. They tortured people here. Daniel stepped back, his heart pounding. "Let's get out of here, Max. This is wrong. We shouldn't be here." But just as they turned to leave, the door they'd entered swung shut with a resounding clang. They rushed to it, pounding and pulling, but it wouldn't budge. "Help! Somebody!" Daniel screamed, his voice echoing down the empty halls. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, they heard it again. The shuffling sound, closer this time, accompanied by a faint whisper. It was soft, barely audible, but chilling. "You can't leave." They turned, pressing their backs to the door as the sound grew louder, filling the room with an unnatural presence. Shadows twisted and crawled along the walls, shapes that seemed almost human but not quite. What is that?" Max stammered, his eyes wide with terror. The whispers grew louder, mingling with the sounds of distant screams and the rhythmic beeping of hospital machines. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, pulsating with the memories of the pain that had once filled this place. Desperation took hold as they frantically searched for another way out. Their flashlights flickered, casting uneven light that only deepened the horror around them. Each shadow seemed to move on its own, stretching and shifting, reaching for them. Finally, they spotted another door on the far side of the room. Racing toward it, they burst into a hallway identical to the one they'd entered from. But something was wrong. The walls were different, shifting subtly, and the air felt thicker, oppressive. They sprinted down the corridor, turning corners and passing empty rooms. But each turn brought them back to the same hallway, the same doors, and the same sickening smell. We're going in circles," Daniel gasped, his face pale with panic. Max shook his head, breathing heavily. "No, it can't be. We just need to find the stairs." But no matter which way they turned, they always found themselves back at the door with the metal chair. It was as if the hospital itself were playing with them, trapping them in an endless loop with no way out. Then, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They were no longer alone. Shadows flickered along the walls, twisted shapes that seemed to pulse with life. A faint outline of a figure appeared at the end of the hallway, a tall, dark silhouette with hollow eyes that stared directly at them. "Run!" Max shouted, grabbing Daniel's arm as they sprinted back down the hall. But the figure was everywhere, shifting, multiplying, until they were surrounded by the silent, staring faces. Each one had the same hollow eyes, the same contorted expressions, as if they were trapped in eternal suffering. Daniel's knees gave out, and he fell to the ground, gasping for breath. Max pulled him up, shaking him. "We can't stop. Get up, Daniel." But as they moved, the walls began to close in around them, the corridor shrinking and twisting, until they were forced to crouch, barely able to move. The hospital seemed to be consuming them, its walls squeezing them into smaller and smaller spaces. Their flashlights flickered and finally went out, plunging them into darkness. In the blackness, the whispers grew deafening, filling their minds with fragments of broken sentences, words that didn't make sense but carried a weight of despair. "Never escape forever." The cold intensified, numbing their fingers and toes as they huddled together, helpless in the dark. Time lost all meaning, and they couldn't tell if minutes or hours had passed. The only constant was the endless whispers and the faint, ghostly sounds of machinery and voices from long ago. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Max, I don't think we're getting out of here." Max held him tightly, his own voice shaking. "We'll find a way. We have to." But as they sat in the darkness, surrounded by the tortured souls of Hollow Pines General, they both knew the truth. They were lost, swallowed by a place that thrived on suffering and despair. And as the whispers closed in, Max and Daniel's screams joined the chorus of the forgotten, forever echoing through the empty halls of the abandoned hospital, where they would remain, part of its horror and its endless hunger for the living. Days later, when Max and Daniel failed to return, a search party was sent to the hospital, but they found nothing, no signs of the boys, no evidence of their presence. But sometimes, late at night, the locals swear they can see shadows in the windows of the abandoned hospital, and if they listen closely, they might hear faint voices calling from the depths below. And though no one has dared to go back in, they all know the truth. The hospital is alive, and it's always waiting for its next victims.